All right, our next item is revisions to student rights and code of conduct policies, first reading. Superintendent Kingsley.
Thank you. Reviewing PSD's revisions to student rights and code of conduct policies this evening is our district's legal and policy counsel, Ms. Autumn Aspen. Autumn, welcome. It's good to see you.
All right, good evening. Tonight I'll be discussing some potential changes to policies included within the Student Rights and Code of Conduct booklet. As you may be aware, under state law, there are certain policies that the board is required to approve and adopt for the Code of Conduct. So each spring, the administration will take a look at the policies that are included within the Code of Conduct and see if there's any that need some potential revisions and bring those forward to the board for the review and approval. And policies that are reviewed by the board are generally done in 2 readings. Tonight is the first reading, so no action will be taken. And if there's any feedback from the board tonight, then those changes will be incorporated into the policies and be brought back for a second reading at the next board meeting for approval by the board. Tonight there are 3 policies I will be discussing. And the first one is policy JLCDB on the administration of medical marijuana to qualified students on district property. This is a new policy that is required by changes to state law. The other policy is policy JLCD on administering medicine to students, asthma, food allergy, and anaphylaxis health management. This is a current policy we have that will have some potential changes based on the change to state law as well as some other changes to that policy. And the last one is policy JLCDR, which is administering medicine to students. This is a policy that's not approved by the board. It's a superintendent policy, but given that it is the corresponding regulation to policy JLCD, I'm bringing it forward just for context for the board tonight. So the first policy I'll be discussing is policy JLCDB, which, as I mentioned, is a new policy. And just for everyone's reference in the board, the full policies are in the board packet for your review, and also there's some red line versions of the policies that are existing to show where those proposed changes are. And in this presentation tonight, I'll just be highlighting some of the key changes, and I won't have the entire policy on the PowerPoint, but they are there for your review in Novus. So as I mentioned, under SB 2156, Colorado law changed last year, and the law now mandates that school districts adopt a policy that includes processes for storage, possession, and administration of medical marijuana on school grounds for a student who holds a valid recommendation for medical marijuana. And within the policy, there's some key definitions in there that define certain parts of the policy. One of that is a qualified student and which students could actually be administered medical marijuana. And the policy defines that as a student who holds a valid recommendation for medical marijuana from a licensed physician and is registered with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment for the use of medical marijuana, and for whom the administration of medical marijuana cannot reasonably be accomplished outside of school hours. And also within the policy, there's definition for which forms of marijuana could be administered, and those are limited to non-smokable products like oils, edible products, or lotions that can be administered and fully ingested or absorbed in a short period of time. The law also permits but does not require school staff to volunteer to securely store, administer, or assist in the administration of medical marijuana. So it's important to note that it is voluntary for staff. It would not be a requirement for any staff to participate in the administration of medical marijuana. And it's also important to note that this policy will only apply to students. It does not apply or permit staff to store, use, or medical marijuana for themselves, so it's purely a student policy. So because the state law and the changes that are required that we had to make, our policy and practice from before is changing. So I wanted to provide some context to the board as far as what it will look like in the timeline for implementation of this policy. So if this policy is approved by the board, it will be effective July 1st of this year. And along with that, we will be developing some standard operating procedures for implementing the policy in a systemic way. And these SOPs will go into more detail on how the policy will be implemented at schools. And it will include information on how and where the medical marijuana could be securely stored and where it could be administered in school sites, and also a process for reviewing and approving requests for administration of medical marijuana. And those SOPs, along with the policy, will be communicated to staff and families once they're all finalized and approved. And And also, given this shift in practice based on from our previous policy to this new one that will be required by state law, I also want to provide some information on what this means for staff, schools, students, and families. So staff may choose to volunteer to securely store, administer, or assist in the administration of medical marijuana to any student with a valid recommendation for medical marijuana. However, as I noted before, staff, including nurses and health techs, will not be required to volunteer to do that administration. The district will also have the sole discretion to determine the location for administration to ensure it does not create a risk of disruption to the educational environment or exposure to other students. And this will be standard across the district. As well, some just notes for families. A student's parent and guardian must present to school with a valid recommendation for medical marijuana from a licensed physician and valid registration from the state of Colorado. And if there are no staff members who volunteer at a school site, then parents and guardians would still be required to administer the medical marijuana. And what it means for students is students cannot possess or self-administer medical marijuana. This isn't a change from past practice. It was never allowed for students to possess or self-administer medical marijuana, so that is remaining the same. And students' possession, use, or being under the influence of medicine inconsistent with this policy, including medical marijuana, would be covered as a violation of policy JICH, which is our policy on student conduct involving drugs and alcohol. So that's the high-level summary of the policy that we are now required to implement based on change in state law. So at this point, I wanted to pause and see if the board had any questions on this policy or any proposed language changes to the policy before moving on to the next one.
Questions? Go ahead, DJ.
I just want to clarify that the standard operating procedure, isn't going to be developed before we have the second reading. We're going to do the second reading of the policy and then work on that way. Is that?
It won't be finalized by the time of the second reading, but we will have it, we're working on it, and we'll have it in place before the July 1st implementation where the policy takes effect.
Okay. My thinking, I guess, behind that was I just wonder if there's something that we need to alter in the policy because of that, but okay, yeah, makes sense.
And I think the intent there is also that we want to make sure we have the final policy language, and then from there we can go and make sure the SOPs align with that policy.
Any other questions on this? Go ahead. Kristen? No? Okay. Go ahead then, please, Autumn.
Okay. So the next policy I'll be discussing is policy JLCD, and this is an existing policy within our code of conduct, but there are a few changes, and I'll just highlight those in the next few slides. So at the beginning of the policy, there is just now a reference to the new policy JLCDB, which is the one that we've just been discussing. And as you see in the full version online, the section that had medical marijuana before within this policy is struck in entirety because now that is all included within the new policy JLCDB. And in the section that discusses rules applicable to all students, to all medicine except medical marijuana, there is an addition in this section for if there are verbal requests to administer medicine to a student, there are some restrictions there, and one is that it has to be verified by the nurses have to verify it with the student or parent's guardian, and we're adding a requirement in there that it also has to be confirmed with the student's prescribing healthcare provider to conform with practice and based on requirements for our nurses. And we have a new section that would be included in this policy, and that is on the use of stock epinephrine auto-injectors in emergency situations. This section is not required under state law, but it is specifically permitted to have in our policy under state law. And in this change, it would allow the district to have a stock supply of epinephrine for uses in emergency. And the administration would be to students. It's student-specific, not to any other individuals on school grounds. And it must be in accordance with applicable state law and State Board of Education rules. Along with this, we will have to have a few procedural steps, including having a standing order from a licensed physician and also implement some training for staff. And our plan is to have the stock supply as well as all the other procedure steps in place for the beginning of the school year, starting in 2022-23 school year. And similar to that addition, there's also a proposed change to this policy to include for us to have a stock supply of opiate antagonists to use in emergency situations. And this is also permitted under state law but not required. And for this one, just for some reference, the most common opiate antagonist is Narcan, just for some reference there, figuring out what that is. But under this policy, we would be allowed to stock it in our schools. We would also have training required before employees would be able to administer it in emergency situations, as well as a standing order similar to the stock epinephrine. And also, I just wanted to note as well that currently our SROs do carry Narcan, so it is already carried by our SROs in our schools, and to our knowledge, it hasn't been used yet. And hopefully it won't have to be used. So are there any questions on this policy or the changes, or any other proposed language changes for this one?
Questions or comments? Go ahead, Kristen.
I just want to express appreciation for the stock epinephrine and opiate antagonists. Those are great things to have. So thank you for adding that in there.
All right, continue, Autumn.
All right, and then the last policy I'll be discussing tonight is policy JLCDR. And as I mentioned before, this one will not come back for a second reading for the board because it is a superintendent policy, but there are some changes that are very similar to the ones that we had just discussed in policy JLCD. As you'll see here, one of the changes is just to reference the new policy JLCDB. And there's also a change to the safety precautions, which eliminates some language that states that there could be a district-wide protocol developed by a licensed physician for administering specified non-prescription medicines. And this is because we don't currently have this, and we also aren't planning on having this protocol developed, so it's just to conform with what we have as our practice. There's also some language changes to correct the name of our error report form, which is the form used if there is an error in administration of medicine, and also a statement that clarifies that those forms are submitted to the health services coordinator. And the last change in this regulation is just clarification in the record keeping section to state that the records are maintained until the student's 21st birthday, which aligns with other health records in our district. So just to clarify that that's how long those records are kept. And then if there's any other questions on that regulation or any other questions related to the code of conduct, I'm happy to take those.
Anything else? Looks like not. Thank you so much, Autumn. Appreciate it. And I assume we'll see this again next meeting. Is that the plan?
Yes, I will bring these back for a second reading for the board, and then they'd be approved then, and then we'll have them in the code of conduct starting in the next school year.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate
you.
your work on this.